Oh hey, it's Wes, in some very dramatic lighting. Why are we sitting here, in the comfy chair? Well, we're going to be doing a full run-through of the entire menu system of the new Sony a7 IV. We might as well get comfortable, because it's going to be a long one. There are going to be chapter links down in the description to help you find what you're looking for. Let's settle in and get this started. First, we're going to start by pressing the function menu button. Now the function menu can vary depending on whether you're in photo or video mode, which is this selector up top here. And we'll get into more about those differences later. In the function menu, or the FN menu, you'll find a lot of shortcuts for things that you will use a lot more often. Now all of these menus can be fully customized, so this function menu, you can make it your own. In my function menu, you'll see that I've already changed things around a bit here. It doesn't really matter what the default was because I want you to make this camera your own. So here I have my audio recording level, so I can change that up and down. Focus mode, I don't normally put that in there. I find that there are more options in the function menu than I need, and so some of them end up just being carryovers. Gamma display assist. I love to have that on, especially in auto mode, so if you switch to S-Log or S-Log2 or HLG, the screen is always going to be showing you an approximation of what your results will be, and that's super convenient. If you're going to be using your own custom LUTs, or you don't think the default Sony LUTs will be useful to you, then maybe you want to turn that off. Picture profile. This is where you can switch and choose between different recording profiles, such as S-Log and HLG. I love the S-Log3, and we'll talk about that more later. Speaking about talking about more, I will have a full review of this camera, super in-depth, but I'm still doing a lot of testing a little later on, and I'm going to have a few shorter videos as well, just talking about how this camera works and compared to other things. Zebra display. I always use zebras, love zebras, because that tells me when something is overexposed and not recoverable. So we can switch through different levels of zebras. So if something is overexposed, you'll easily know on the screen. I generally keep mine set to this, C2, and I customize it, so C stands for custom, to a lower limit of 95+. It's good for flat profile video or standard profile video or even RAW, because you know at that 95 point, you'll still be able to use the file. Now if you're using S-Log or S-Log3, it's great to use C1, put it on a range of 55 ±5, and the skin tones that you want to be properly exposed, you get those into that standard range. It feels a little counterintuitive in that the parts of the skin that you most want to see best have zebras on them, but you get used to it. Let's back out of this by pressing the menu button. Something interesting about this camera that previous Sony cameras don't have is that when it's in autofocus mode, it will still show your peaking lines. Most other Sony cameras don't show your peaking lines if you're in autofocus, only in manual focus. So I turn on my peaking. In the menu, I'm going to set it to red. And I put it on low, because when you go all the way up to high, you end up getting a lot of false positives on that. So anything that's red on here or rimmed in red, we know is reasonably sharp. It's great for video and great for manual focus lenses. Here I have my white balance control, where I can go in and really do a deep dive on how the green versus red and the white balance. We'll talk more about white balance later, of course. And my SteadyShot settings. There are 3 SteadyShot settings here. When we get into the SteadyShot menu, we'll see more about that. APS-C versus Super 35. I can't change that because unfortunately with this camera, if we're set to 4K 60p, you are stuck in Super 35 mode. And then my creative look. One of my favorite things about this camera, this is a fantastic tool. Now, most people say, you shoot in RAW, this doesn't matter, but for me it really does. As opposed to previous Sony cameras where you get to control contrast, saturation, and sharpness, you have a ton of control here. And what does that do for you? Well, number one, if you're shooting in just straight 709 video, which is not log or extended dynamic range modes, this gives you an enormous amount of control. More control than you would ever expect, really, because you can use this to give yourself a flatter picture profile without using a LUT or a log profile, which is very interesting. So here we see contrast control, we're used to that. Now in the previous Sony cameras, I cranked that all the way down so that the files would be more editable. But I don't have to here because I have a separate highlight control. So I can change my highlights. So I'll bring those highlights all the way down. Then I have a shadow control where I can bring the shadows up or bring the shadows down, depending on how contrasty I want it to look. Now again, there's separate contrast, but there's also brightness control. Then there's fade. Don't usually like to do that because I don't like a washed out look. Saturation control. I kind of like it right dead in the middle, especially if I plan on, again, not doing a tremendous amount of editing here. Then there's sharpness control. I turn that up a bit, not just for video that I'm making, because excessive sharpness in video, it can look a little bit too grainy. But when you up the sharpness, what's going on here, and this is the important part for those of you who are using this camera to shoot in RAW and think this isn't useful, all these settings affect your actual JPEG preview. So there's a preview image that you will view of your RAW file. Now once I get all of these parameters edited, this file is going to look a lot more like my finished RAW file. And this is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's easier for me to eyeball and figure out what this is supposed to look like in camera. Number two, if I go to show a client, I very much shoot to edit. I use my own somewhat aggressive picture profiles when I'm editing in Capture One. And so I designed this to look a lot like how my finished edited files will be. And this is fantastic. So I can get this dialed in, and then I can show my clients the image on the back of the camera, and it will be much closer to how it will actually look after I've edited it. So I turn up the sharpness, which will make the image pop a little bit better on the back of the camera. And it will also make it a little crisper in the viewfinder and on the back screen while you're taking the picture. So it affects the preview in all ways. So upping that sharpness is very useful in some ways. You just have to be careful with that when you're making video. You might want to turn that back down. And then there's actually a clarity slider. This is super surprising to me. Now the clarity slider doesn't have a lot of impact. It's kind of a weak slider, but overall, fantastic. I love having all of these settings here. All these buttons on the back are fully customizable though, so I don't want to get too deep into those because they can become whatever you want. Let's hit the menu. All right. Now for starters, you start in this gray star menu, which is your favorites. To begin, there's absolutely nothing in this menu because it's up to you to fill it up with the stuff that you will use most. So here's what my menu looks like. First of all, I'm just going to show you how to set that up. You go to My Menu Setting, you go to Add an Item, and then you pick from this extensive list of things that you can add in here. I wouldn't set this up immediately because the first thing you're going to want to do, customize all the buttons on the back of the camera to be the things that you really use a lot. So the My Menu section, your favorite section, is kind of a step behind that. It's also a step behind the function menu. So this is just kind of a third level of things. And so we're not going to add anything to it at this time because I'm just going to show you what I have in here. So in my menu, I have file format, movie settings, slow and quick settings, format, which is to format the cards, electronic first curtain shutter toggle, auto review. Most people don't use this, but when I do real estate photos, I like to use that. AF transition speeds, display quality, finder frame rate, and then on the third My Menu, I have custom key settings because sometimes I like to go in and change those. Let's really dig in now. We're going to talk about the actual menu system. Yes, it took us that long to get there. So this menu is going to look different depending on whether you're in photo or video mode. So currently we're in video mode. So our file format is concerning the formats of the various Sony codecs. So what do we have here? We have APS-C HS, that's the top level. That's the high compression. That's going to come in as a H.265 high efficiency video codecs. Some computers have a lot of trouble editing these. If you have like an M1 Mac though, it's no problem at all. And that will give us higher quality with a lower bit rate. Then we have XAVC-S, that's our standard MPEG encoding, but for 4K. Then XAVC-S for HD, just 1080. Then we go down to the all-I encoding, which means it is a much beefier codec in that it doesn't skip frames. All these other codecs, it uses keyframes and then compresses frames in between them using that information, whereas all-I is essentially just a series of individual JPEG images, which takes up a tremendous amount of space but is much easier to edit and has less compression artifacts. And we'll go down to movie settings. I'm not a big fan of how Sony lays out these menus. It could be easier. You could just have one menu where you choose your codec, choose your frame rate, choose your bit rate, choose your resolution. One place, one-stop shop. Unfortunately, they don't do that. I think Canon has started doing that. So in the movie settings, we get to choose our frame rate. Since I'm in HS, there is no 30p option, which is kind of a shame. And also because I'm in 4K, there are no 120p options because we can't do 4K 120 on this. This isn't an A7S III. And there's also record setting, which is our bit rates. So the base one, 45 megabits per second, 420. Now that might seem low, but since this is an HS, this is closer to an equivalent of about 90 megabits per second in the standard codec. So that's actually going to be fairly crisp video, but I like to go up and with the starter of 422 10-bit. All of these are 10-bit because I'm in HS. Let's switch over to 4KS. Now we have 8-bit options. So HS starts you at 10-bit because it has more efficient compression. We'll go back to HS where I like to hang out because I have an M1 Pro Mac. And so this is my favorite codec right here, 100 megabits per second, 422 10-bit, very nice, easy to edit. I find it's not quite as easy to edit as the A7S III footage, but your mileage may vary personally. S&Q settings, so this is what we're going to get when we switch this dial to slow and quick. That's what S&Q stands for. So the recording frame rate is your target frame rate. That's telling the camera what frame rate your end video is going to be, so that when you play it back in your camera, it's going to slow it down to that rate that you'll have slowed it down in your timeline. My last shoot, I was shooting a 24p video, and so I set that to 24p. Slows it down real good. Then the S&Q frame rate is how fast it's actually shooting. Now, it can only go up to 60 frames per second when we're shooting in 4K mode. So if we want to go to 120, we have to bump this back down to 1080. And then we also have our settings here. Can't go above 100 megabits per second here. I just have a V60 card in here, not a V90. But that's as high as I want to go. Proxy settings. You can get the camera to write a smaller proxy file to the card. Find that this isn't a super useful process anymore. It's very useful if you're shooting in RAW and it's an incredibly heavy format, but most computers these days really are capable of editing these videos without a lot of proxies. But honestly, if I wanted a proxy, I would just get my video editor to do that on import myself instead of complicating the process inside this camera. APS-C Super 35 shooting. I can't change this option right now because again, I'm at 4K 60p and that reduces my frame. But this is where I would be able to change it. Shading compensation. I'm not sure why they call it shading. I'm pretty sure it's actually vignetting compensation. That's a strange way of saying it. Chromatic aberration compensation. It's to fix purple fringing, mostly for JPEGs and straight video. Distortion compensation. Doesn't work with active SteadyShot. We'll talk about that more later on, but there are a lot of things in this camera competing for processing power and cropping power, and that is one of them. So it can only do so many things at once. Breathing compensation, one of the best features of this camera. It's great for the 35G Master, this lens right here, which has a lot of focus breathing. This lens right here, Sony Zeiss 55 1.8, it's not compatible. Maybe later on they will add that profile to it, but it's kind of unfortunate that they don't have that built in. It's only a select list of lenses, mostly G Master lenses, that they have done that for. We have record media settings. Number one is to select to format your cards. When you go to format, it's going to give you two options, a quick format or a long format. Honestly, I would suggest only using the long format because that adds the most stability to your card. Wipes it super clean though, so if you hit that, you're not getting any files back. Record media settings. This lets you choose whether you're writing to one card or two cards, writing RAW to one and JPEG to the other, that would be sort, or simultaneous recording, which I prefer, writing all the same files to both cards. This has dual UHS-2 card slots, so it's very good at simultaneous recording. It writes them very fast. And then if you're doing writing to just one card, you can use auto switch media, which will allow you to write to one card, and then when it runs out of space, automatically start writing to the second card. I'm not a huge fan of that because I like my redundancy. and it doesn't give you that redundancy. And then at the bottom is your image quality settings. It took me a while to find this. I didn't expect it to find it here. So right now my file format for JPEGs isn't JPEG at all. It's HEIF, the high efficiency files. That actually gives you a much higher quality file than a JPEG. But we're not seeing all the settings in here right now because we're still in video mode. So I had better switch back to photo mode so that we can start this menu over in photo mode. And here we have some new settings. So our quality settings are now applying to JPEGs and RAW files and so forth. So here's where we choose what our compressed images will be. You can shoot just RAW or RAW plus JPEG or just JPEG or just HIF or RAW plus HIF. So I like to use that nice high quality HIF file here. And I'm writing to both slots in RAW. And this is the menu right here, image quality settings, when you're on photo mode, where you can choose what kind of RAW file you're going to use. I am a huge fan of the lossless compressed RAW file. Unfortunately, that gives us a much slower frames per second on this camera, but that's fine with me. I have an A9. If I need something super fast, I can use that. But especially for real estate photography, high dynamic range stuff, high contrast situations, the Sony compressed RAWs can sometimes give you trouble. Not always by any means. So you can use compressed RAW, which is nice and quick and small, then lossless compressed RAW is a little bit bigger and a little bit slower than uncompressed RAW, big files. Since I'm not shooting in HIF right now, I can't change the HIF quality there. So let's change this just to HEIF. Then I can set myself up a nice, very high quality HEIF file there. There's some redundancy in this menu here because you can kind of get that in the media recording settings, which jumps you over image quality settings. It kind of digs around all in the same places. So let's switch that back to RAW. Next setting here, recover image database. So most of the time the camera will do this automatically if there's an error on the card, but if you think there's a card error, then you can go in and recover the database manually. I don't recommend trying this a lot. It's usually successful, but sometimes you lose a few pictures in the process. But that tries to reconstruct it in case something got corrupted. And then display media info. This kind of tells us stuff that we already know. 1,702 pictures left to be taken on this card, or an hour and a half of HS video. And that's something that we see when we're back out here regardless. It's already on the screen. File and folder settings. Most people don't go into this. So file number series. So for this, if I change cards or reformat, then it's going to continue the file numbering that it already was using. But if I go to reset, every time I put in a new card or reformat, it starts me back at the beginning of the series, or 0. Or I can force a reset right now. I can also change the name of the folder that the camera puts the photos in. It's not super useful to me because I just plug it in and Capture One immediately starts pulling photos off of it. You can change how it names those images. So right now it says DSC and then a bunch of numbers depending on the series. But I can change that. So sometimes I'll do cam 1, cam 2, and then it goes through the series so I know which camera took which pictures. Depends on what kind of photo shoot I'm on. And you can dump it all into their numbered folders or just make sure that it's always in a dated folder. And then you can choose which folder you're recording to. There's only one folder on mine right now because I haven't broken up the folders. But I can create a new folder and then select that folder and start writing to a new folder. This can be useful for a variety of reasons. If you need something like that, you would already know. Then IPTC information. This is an extended form of metadata. I generally don't use this. Speaking of metadata, this is where we can choose what copyright info is written to every file. So you can set copyright, which would be kind of like the studio, and then there's a sub-level here, set photographer. You can also set that as well. And then you can look at the copyright info there. I like to leave that on because in some ways it's an extra layer of protection for copyright, but honestly that's easily scrubbed from the metadata, so it's not actually that important. Then you can write the serial number of the camera to the files. Also not that important, but it can be helpful for theft. Memory recall settings. Like previous Sony cameras, this camera has several memory recall modes. So you can set up a bunch of different custom modes inside the camera, and then you just switch that dial on top here to your custom modes, and it changes all the settings all at once, bada bing, bada boom. Now generally, I mostly use the same settings for most of my stuff, so I don't personally use this. It's currently disabled because I'm not using it. So these are all the different recall modes. I'm not going to talk about all these because that would be a massive tutorial on its own. It's a very useful setup for some people. And then you can write that data to a memory card and then pull it back for another camera. Now the problem with that is it will only work with the same body, with the same firmware. You can't like take your memory recall from this and put it on an A9 II or something like that. And this is where you register those custom modes. And that's why I couldn't apply one, because I don't have any registered right now. And here's a kind of a new setting here. If you plug this in via USB-C to your computer, you can do USB streaming. So here's your frame rate and resolution. I'm not sure how useful that 4K 15p is. That's going to look terrible. And honestly, the 1080-60p is not that useful either, because most streaming services don't even support 60p. Most of the time you want to shoot with 30p. You can do that, I think, only with Twitch right now. So 1080-30p is great. And then you can also have this record your video while you're streaming. So you can have a nice crisp backup of that. Drive mode, you should be familiar with that. That just lets us choose between single shot, low, high, medium frame rates. We can do a self-timer mode. In the self-timer, it takes one shot on this first setting, and then you choose the number of seconds that it waits between those shots, or you can do a more custom mode, which I prefer, 10 seconds 3 images, 10 seconds 5 images, 5 seconds 3 images. That's what those numbers stand for. This is much easier. Then you can do bracketed shots with exposure steps. Lots of options here, tons and tons of options. Sony used to not give a lot of options for that. Generally use the continuous bracket because it's much faster, whereas the single shot bracket, you have to fire it individually yourself every time, and that introduces chance for camera shake. And also, this lets you do white balance bracketing, which is super interesting. And the auto DRO bracketing, I'm not sure why you would use that, and we'll talk about DRO a little bit later. Bracketing settings, so you can use a self-timer in that you press the button and then you let go of the camera and let it take those shots. This is great for long exposures because the camera is no longer shaking from your hand touching it. And you can change the order. Not super important anymore because most photo editing programs will let you rearrange those orders anyway, but if you want to use low, medium, high or medium, low, high, you can do either of those. Interval shooting. I don't want to talk too much about this menu here because it's a lot of different things and most people don't use this, but this lets you set interval timers to take shots over a lengthy period of time, and it lets you choose what kind of shutter you're going to use. Now you have to be careful with the electronic shutter in this camera. It's actually worse than the one in the A7 III, which might be a surprise to you. Not enormously worse, but it is worse. It takes longer to scan that sensor. More megapixels, but the same scan speed, it would seem. And here is where we choose, again, whether or not we're shooting in silent mode, which is full electronic shutter. And it lets you choose the priorities of those shutters. So if you need to be super quiet, you can actually try to make the lens quieter by going to silent priority, which is kind of funny that that's even a consideration. And here's just a straight choice, mechanical electronic shutter. I usually map this to a button on the back, C3, so I can switch between them quickly. Electronic first curtain shutter. There are essentially 3 shutter types in this camera. You can do full electronic, no sounds, or electronic front curtain shutter, where it wipes the sensor electronically and then ends it with a mechanical shutter, or you can do full mechanical shutter by switching that off, where it closes the shutter, opens it for the exposure, closes it again to end the exposure. Why would you use this? Well, electronic front curtain shutter can cause you some issues in some circumstances, such as wide aperture, high shutter speed. It can cause your bokeh to be nervous and incomplete, which is interesting. And With the electronic front curtain shutter on, it also increases the chances of having artificial light banding. Not nearly as much as using straight electronic shutter, but it can happen, so if you're having trouble with banding, shut off the electronic front curtain shutter as well. Some people find that flash syncing is also not as good with the electronic front curtain shutter on, but I've not had much issue with that myself. And here, you decide whether or not the camera will actually hit the shutter and take a picture if there's no lens on. You might want to use this if you're using a legacy manual focus lens that has no communication with the camera. You can also do release without card. So a lot of people like to keep this off so that you can't even try to take a picture if there's no card in here. Interesting thing I found with Sony cameras, you can fill the buffer in this camera and then put a card in and it will write the mode of the card, which is especially interesting like with cameras like this and the A9 that have a huge buffer. You can take 100 pictures, then put a card in, and then it safely writes the mode of the card. I don't recommend doing this on a regular basis because it introduces room for running out of space and having trouble, but there you go. All right, anti-flicker shoot. I always leave this on. It can cause a slight hesitation in taking a picture, but it's negligible. But I leave it on because if the camera notices that there is some flickering going on in the room and the lights, it tries to compensate for that. It tries to take a picture when the lights are the brightest, so we leave that on. Variable shutter is a very interesting tool in that you can set an incredibly specific shutter speed so that you can get your shutter speed perfectly lined up with any artificial lights that might be pulsing in the room. Now, if you have multiple artificial light sources, sometimes you can never find a happy medium here, but this will let you really dial it in to a very specific amount. So sometimes just going at 1/60 or 1/125 won't get you there. Variable shutter will. SteadyShot, here's some interesting stuff. We'll usually leave this on. Sometimes if you're on a tripod or a gimbal, you'll turn it off. And we have this set to auto, so it automatically adjusts the focal length. But I can go to manual if I have a manual focus lens on with no communication with the body and just tell it what focal length it is because it needs to adjust for that. Let's switch back to the video mode so we can see some more settings here. We have active, standard, and off all of a sudden. If you're in active, it crops the sensor in even further to get you even more stable shooting. But if you go to standard, you're not going to have much of a crop, but it's a little less stable. This is one of the weaknesses of the small E-mount flange size. Honestly, it's one of the only weaknesses, as we've seen, like the 51.2 phenomenal wide aperture lens, but you don't have as much room to move that sensor around. So if you're going to use really good stabilization, it's going to have to cut the corners. So that's a shame. Let's go back to photo mode. Zoom. Since we're in RAW, and Sony doesn't let you do funny things with their RAW files, like Nikon, you can have a medium RAW or small RAW, we don't have any punch-in settings here. If I was in video though, we would have some zoom settings here. So let's do that. So we have 3 different kinds of zoom we can apply to the camera without even using a zoom lens. Optical only, which is normal. You can use clear image zoom, which is a bit of a pixel interpolation algorithm that Sony uses. A lot of people say it's crisper than regular digital zoom, or we could just use straight up digital zoom, which reduces your quality as you go in further. And then you can change the speed of the zoom when you're altering the zoom. And you can also change it if you're changing the zoom using a Bluetooth or infrared remote on the camera. Switching back to photo mode. Here's the grid line display. I like to turn that on, and I'll show you why. I use the rule of thirds grid, which helps me line up a picture. You can use different grids though, a square grid, or a diagonal plus square grid. Just depending on your shooting style, this can be useful. Then we'll move on to live view setting display. I usually have a shortcut for this right here, setting display on or off, so that lets the camera decide whether it's showing you what it thinks the image is going to look like versus just exposing it to be visible in the viewfinder. So when setting effect is on, what you see is what you get. Setting effect is off, it just brings up the light and it's more like looking through an optical viewfinder. Now, sometimes you want to turn that off if you're using off-camera flash because the camera doesn't know how much flash output you're using. If you're using a Sony first-party flash, it's a lot better at this though, and it can try to compensate for the flash exposure. But if your flash exposure is making things super wonky, you can just turn that to exposure setting only. Framerate low limit. If you're in very dark environments, your viewfinder will start getting really choppy because it's actually taking longer exposures to be able to see what's going on and give you that preview. But if you don't want to do that, you want to limit how far it goes down, you can set that to on, but then you won't be able to see very well in low light, so I keep that off. Alright, moving right along to our exposure settings. I don't want to dig too far into these because I'm going to assume that you already know about the exposure triangle. So here we get to choose our ISO. We can change the range limit, so if you're in auto ISO, it doesn't let you go past these 2 points. I like to do that because I don't like it to dip you into artificial ISOs, and I don't like it to go crazy high. Sometimes if you don't set the top limit on, you'll find that you set an aperture and a shutter speed that aren't realistic, and you've taken some pictures at like ISO 128,000 and they're just utterly unusable. So I set it to a point where the pictures are still kind of usable, in case I hurt myself. Exposure compensation. So if you're in auto, you can adjust that there, or you can map that by default to this exposure comp dial up here. I actually have this dial mapped to white balance, which is super interesting for video use. Metering mode. Here you can go through the different metering modes. Multi, it takes into account the entire frame, or you can center weight it, or you can make it based on your focus point, or you can just do a super plain average of the entire screen, which is how cameras used to do back in the old days, or you can have it exposed for whatever the highlight is in the scene. I like to use multi, and then use face priority. So if you're in multi and it sees a face, it will try to expose for that face rather than the scene. And I like to link it to focus point. So if you have a focus point, you're focused on something, you want it to expose for that object instead of the rest of the scene. And you can also do exposure lock as soon as you press the shutter button. I don't worry about that too much because I don't use a lot of auto exposure. Flash mode. Fill flash, that's your basic flash mode, that is normal. Use a slow sync or rear curtain sync. Don't want to get too far into that because that is some deep stuff. That will let you play around with like light trails and different effects of flash. Flash compensation. This is useful for when you're doing TTL. Exposure comp, are you taking into account just your ambient exposure or also the flash exposure? Wireless flash, this is just something for Sony flashes. Red eye reduction, that's only useful if you're firing your flash straight into your subject. And then more settings for if you're using a first-party Sony flash. White balance, this might seem obvious, but it's not. So here's the normal obvious white balance menu. You get to choose different preset white balances, or you can create a custom preset, and then if you press set on that, you can set a gray card in front of it, or rather automatically set that white balance, or you can just choose it yourself. One thing that I love in here is you can use the standard, which is kind of a balanced white balance, or you can bias your white balance to more taking the ambiance. So if you have like a candlelit scene and you want it to look very yellow and candly, you can do that. Me, I like to set it on white priority, so it's trying its best to find a white point and make that white, and that's just my photography style. So there's more than one kind of auto white balance, which is interesting. I find that the white gets me closer to my finished product. And then you can get the white balance to lock when you have the shutter half pressed, or if you're taking shots. So half press it locks and stays that way, or you can half press, it doesn't lock, but then locks once you've started shooting continuously. Let's talk about the dynamic range optimizer. Mostly this doesn't affect your raw files, except when it does. So this allows it to pull up shadows automatically in a JPEG or a Rec. 709 video. But if you're shooting RAW, this shouldn't matter. However, it does matter because, as I said before, these creative settings do have an effect on your preview. So if you have your dynamic range optimizer turned on, your preview is going to be fooling your eye into thinking your image is brighter than it actually is in a high dynamic range situation. So you'll want to turn that off if you're doing RAW photography, turn it on if you're shooting JPEG. Creative look, we've already talked about this. I don't get into the preset creative looks much at all because they're all kind of hokey. You can do your own presets when you pull them into Lightroom, but all these options here, once again, to change how your image looks. And then there are picture profiles. We already talked about that. What it's set as a default, you can customize them completely, so you can have your own list of picture profiles that you prefer. So there's a lot of customization to do in there, but again, that would be a whole other video. And then, if you're shooting in JPEG or HEIF, you can set a soft skin effect. Now that might seem hokey, but I actually use this on my A7 III when I have it set up in a photo booth. This isn't available on the A9, so if I'm doing a photo booth, these images will never be touched. They take a JPEG and the JPEG goes to the client or it gets printed. So that's actually a great feature for me. So if you want to put this in a photo booth and you just want shoot to burn, you can put on a light soft skin effect. I'm going to switch this back to our compressed file formats here. Okay, you also can't use it in continuous shooting. It has to be single shot because it has to have time to process it. And then you get to choose low, medium, or high for your soft skin effect. I usually just put it on low because high can look pretty waxy. And I'm going to put that back to RAW before I forget, because I don't want to make that mistake. And we already talked about the zebras. I have them on, and I have them set to custom level 2. You can change them in the menu here, but it's pretty much the same thing. Moving on to our focus modes. Focus menu. Now, I usually set these to a preset on my camera. Let's see, C1, yep, there we can go through. So, single shot AF relies more heavily on contrast detect, and it just locks. So if you have a subject that's moving at all, honestly, in these cameras, you almost never go out of continuous because they're specifically designed to do continuous AF, and they are fantastic at that. In low light, single shot does not work great. So use continuous unless you're doing like a landscape or real estate photography. Automatic AF, it adds a tiny little bit of delay, but it lets the camera choose based on what you're shooting, whether it should be doing single shot or continuous. Again, don't use that much either. Just stay in continuous, especially for shooting human beings. DMF, this lets you use autofocus, but then focus it with your hand on top of that. Some people love this. I never really caught on for me. Or you can just switch to straight up manual focus. A priority in autofocus. So you can set this independently for single shot and continuous, but basically this lets you choose whether the camera is just attempting to take a picture no matter what, or attempting to lock focus confidently on something and then take a picture. So by default, it's on balanced emphasis. This will occasionally get you out of focus frames. If you set it to AF, you will have a reduced frame rate in high action situations, but you will have very few pictures out of focus, but you'll have less pictures. If you set it to release, you'll get all those frames out, but they won't necessarily all be in focus. And you can set that independently for continuous as well. Tracking sensitivity, this is how sticky your tracking is. I generally keep it on standard, but I change this one quite a bit. And so if you want it to lock on more, you go up that scale. If you want it to be able to switch subjects more rapidly, then you go back down that scale. AF Illuminator, I turn this off. I don't like it, I find it distracting, I find it unnecessary with modern Sony mirrorless cameras. They're pretty good in the dark anyway, but if you want it to fire an AF beam out of your flash or flash transmitter, or fire the AF assist lamp on the camera, you have to set that to on or auto. And then also, if you want to use an AF beam on your flash, you have to be an AF-S, which is very annoying and not super useful. And then again, we get to choose whether we're focusing on focusing or silence in our lenses. And here's where you can decouple the focusing from the shutter button and move it to the AF button here. I like to focus using the shutter, but if you like using back button focus, you would switch that to off, and then your shutter button will no longer focus. Then there's pre-AF. I think there were some past Sony cameras where that was set to on, and that really drains your battery when you're between shots. I always set this to off, because otherwise it's just hunting and hunting, which it kind of does when you're set to video mode. Moving on to focus area. We have a lot of options here normally. I'm going to go back and go to number 2 first. I love this setting so much. Focus area limit. I don't use all of the possible focus areas. Never do. And so you can cut them out, which makes it easier to switch between your different focus modes. Let's talk about them. So this top row here are just straight autofocus, not tracking. You can use wide, which is the whole frame, or a zone, which is a smaller part of the frame you can move around. Center. You can use a movable spot of small, medium, or large size, or an expandable spot. I find expandable spots not as useful now that you have real-time tracking. And then this lower part is all those things except with real-time tracking. And so when I go to my focus areas, I don't have a lot of options, which makes it much faster for me to switch between my focus modes. So I only have 4 of them. And speaking of customized buttons, I have this joystick right here customized to toggle through my various focus modes. So I'll stay in wide tracking. Then when I want to go to a tracking spot, I just press that once and all of a sudden I have a spot. That's super handy. This one, I think it was on by default in some Nikon cameras at one point. This can be very confusing. If you rotate your camera is aware that you've rotated it, and it will move your autofocus point or area to adjust for the fact that you've rotated your camera. This is very confusing because you turn your camera and then the point moves all of a sudden. Some people like this, but I find it very distracting. Focus area color. This has been a massive pet peeve of mine. The white or gray focus box on the A7 III is incredibly hard to see at times. In this one, you can make it red. For some reason, there is no firmware update to fix that on the A7 III. Kind of annoying. So as soon as I get this thing going, change that focus box to red. AF area registration. So here, when you turn that on, then you can press and hold the function button when your focus point is in a particular spot, and it will remember that spot. This little blinking spot right here, that's the spot I have remembered. And then you can assign a button to recall that point. So if your focus point is somewhere else, you press that button, it bounces back over there. I don't currently have a button mapped to that, although I have the area registered, so I can't jump back to it. But that's nice and easy to do. I'm going to turn that back off because I find the easy focus mode switch better. And then if you have an area registered, you can wipe it out using that. All right, face and eye autofocus. One of the greatest features of mirrorless cameras, and we have tons of options for that now. Now, I will leave that on, and then I will have a quick button, this AEL button. If I'm having trouble with face detect autofocus, I can turn it off, such as if it's focusing on the wrong face, then I'll just use a spot point to focus on the one that I want. Sometimes it can be a bit jumpy. And then you can choose between human, animal, and bird with this camera. Previous cameras were just human and animal, and then previous before that were just human. Then I have a quick button for this. I have this limited to not have bird because I never take pictures of birds. So I can just press this button to toggle between human and animal because sometimes I do take pictures of dogs. And here, I'm not sure why you would want to bias it for left or right eye because you can switch that with your focus selector. So I just set it to auto where it tries to focus on the nearest eye, which is what it should do. And then you want the frame display on so you can see what it's actively trying to focus on. You can register certain faces using these 2 options here to have priority over everything else, but at a distance and in mixed lighting, this often doesn't work well, so it's not great to rely on that. But when it does work, essentially you have a face that takes priority. People would use that for a bride or something. You have to specifically take a picture of their face, and then in theory, if you're taking a picture of a group setting, it will focus on them before anyone else. But again, that's very touch and go. Moving on to number 4, focus magnifier in manual focus. I love this. So if you have a lens that communicates with the body, as soon as you turn, let's go to it now. Go to manual focus. As soon as you turn the focus wheel, it punches into where your focus point is. So not just anywhere, you can set a focus point in manual focus and then it punches into that spot. That's super handy. Magnification time. So if you have this set to no limit, you can keep working on that focus. If there is a limit, it will lose interest in what you're doing and go back. I like no limit. Initial focus, I like that as high as possible, 5.5. Then a new feature where you can use that punch in combination with autofocus, which is kind of crazy. Peaking level, we already talked about peaking. It lets you find edges and manually focus more easily and even autofocus more easily. Unfortunately, the screen is kind of low resolution, so at times, especially for video, it's hard to confirm your focus. This will make that easier. Moving on to the playback menu. Here you can choose whether you're reading from card 1 or card 2 when you hit that playback button to see what's on the card. And then you can choose how it structures that playback, whether you go by just the date of the pictures, or you go through folders, or you go through a movie display. Magnification. This chooses how punching in on pictures works. There I am from a picture I took. So most of these, when I try to activate them, they're going to affect the images in playback. So if I play back here and then press menu, it automatically lands me in the playback menu, because this menu is specifically for when you're looking at pictures. Now, one of the best and most interesting features in this menu is enlarge initial position, focus position. So if you had a focus point on your picture, when you go to look at the picture and you go to punch in, it will punch in not in the middle, but on where your focus point was, which is super convenient. And then you can go in and protect or rate certain images on the card. In delete, so you can choose when you go to delete a picture, pops up a confirmation, do you want to delete? You can choose whether the cursor is on cancel or delete. I put it on delete, so I bring up the confirmation and can quickly delete a picture. Not as quickly as this setting, which I don't use because I feel like there's a little more chance for error. You can have it set to just pressing delete twice, pops, gone. Makes it too easy in my mind. I don't want to get too far into these because, again, that would be a tremendous amount of information. You can actually do some minor edits to your images in the camera, just for JPEG and HEICs though, HEIF. Then you can choose automatic playback for continuous or interval photos. And then you can choose how the images are displayed in playback. Whether you're looking at 9 images when you punch out, or 30, whether or not they're grouped. Display rotation is super useful because if you took a vertical picture, you turn your camera and then it shows vertically, takes up more of the screen. You can choose whether or not it shows the focus frame on the image as you're playing it back. Then you can alter the time on the image. Boy, would that be laborious if you had to do that on a bunch of pictures. And then you can choose how quickly images scroll as you roll through them, depending on which dial. So you could set one of these dials to be a very fast one, and one of them to be a slower one when you're going through a lot of pictures. That can be very useful. And then we have our options for connecting to smartphone. Again, we're getting a bit out of the scope here, but just really quick, you go in smartphone registration to connect to your smartphone for the first time. Here you can select images to send to your smartphone. Here you can cut off the transfer if something's gone wrong. Here you can let it use Bluetooth Low Energy to stay connected to your phone at all times. Use a little extra power though. And here we can change our remote shooting settings. So if you're tethered to your phone and you're controlling the shooting from there, you can save the images just to the phone or just to the camera or to both. Again, I like redundancy, so both. You can choose whether it's just a small image or a very large image transferred. And you can choose what kind of picture is sent. Doesn't like to send RAWs very much though. We have FTP functions. We have Wi-Fi settings. Again, I don't want to dig into these because these are very specific and can take a very long time to explain, and this video is already very long. We can manage our Bluetooth functionality, turn that off or on, and change our pairing lists. Wired LAN, you need an adapter to do that. There is no Cat6 port on this. And here's where we can turn airplane mode off and on, change the network name of this device, and reset all our network settings if something got messed up. Moving on to our last section, generally known as the toolbox menu, but really it's this actual settings menu. This stuff is kind of self-explanatory. We can change our language, we can change the date and time, and what time zone we're in. And we can actually switch this between NTSC and PAL, which is nice. A lot of previous Sony cameras came set as one or the other depending on the region you bought it in and would be locked to that. Here you can change it, and that locks out or locks in certain frame rates depending on your region. Here is where you can save and load settings, and as I mentioned previously and similarly, you can only save and load settings on exactly the same respective cameras. So if I have settings on this, it has to go on an A7 IV if I'm copying it over from an SD card. And here is where we get to set and customize all of the buttons on our camera and lens. This takes a long time to do, and it's very much subject to your own preferences. You can make these custom buttons change depending on whether you're in photo or video mode. I try to keep them the same because when you're a hybrid shooter like me, it really messes with muscle memory if these buttons aren't the same, so I try to create a layout of buttons that can work for both circumstances. And then you can even have shortcuts for while you're viewing images in playback. And here is where you get to change the function menu. You have two different function menus depending on whether you're in photo or video. Let's get back out of there. And here you can independently change which things carry over between photo and video mode. So this is getting super granular now. I like this display screen set. So when you press this top display button here, it cycles through different things that you see on your display. And as you can see, I don't have a lot because in here, monitor, I've restricted the number of things it goes through. Monitor off's not useful to me. This viewfinder display, not useful to me. Histogram display, I generally only use that if I'm looking through the viewfinder. The level display I only use on this and not in the viewfinder. And no info display, so it starts with a little bit of info and then times out and it goes away. So it lets you choose what you want to see, and you can do the same for the viewfinder. But I can't show that to you because it only shows up in there. Oh, you can do that now. In previous Sony cameras, you couldn't adjust this without looking through the viewfinder. Interesting. And here you can choose whether or not pressing the shutter when you're in movie mode starts the video. This was more useful in past Sony cameras where the movie button was in some weird spot. But now that it's right next to the shutter, it doesn't serve much of a purpose, honestly. Then you can choose the behavior of a zoom ring. Now, this is only a zoom ring that's electronic. Most of these zoom rings are not, but this lets you change which direction it goes. And here we can change the function of our dials. I like to have aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, lets you control them all. And then again, as I mentioned before, this exposure comp dial I have set to our Kelvin, our white balance. So I can go in here and very quickly change the white balance of my scene. Oh, I have to have setting effect on. Remember we talked about that. So that is super convenient if you're doing video. And then you can customize those dials depending on which custom mode you're in, but as I mentioned before, I don't use those custom modes. Again, it's a muscle memory thing. And you can change which way you have to rotate these dials for them to work. And you can also have a lock setting. I use this for cameras that I set up at the church for live streaming that other people might be handling, so I set the settings and then I lock them all in, so it's a little harder to change them afterwards. Touch operation, that depends on whether or not your touchscreen is working. Look at that, I'm using the touchscreen. It's hard to get used to because for so long you couldn't navigate the menu with the touchscreen. So touch operation is on. You can use the touch panel, or you can use it just as a touchpad when you're in the viewfinder. I like to use both. Speaking of the touchpad and the viewfinder, lots of settings for that. So when your eye is up to the viewfinder, you can use that to move your focus point. You can have absolute position, which if you put your thumb in a certain spot on the screen, it will immediately jump to that spot. Or relative position, which is wherever you put your thumb, that will be where the focus point is, and then you're just sliding it around from there. And then you can limit the area. Since I have a big nose, I have to limit that to just the right 1/4. I find that's enough anyway. But if you don't have a big nose mashed against the screen, you can use the whole screen for a giant focus pad. Honestly, you have to move your thumb too much for that to be useful though. And then, this is a great setting. And here, when you're using the touch screen and taking a picture, you get to decide whether it's just a one-time focus or it initiates tracking. I like to initiate tracking because I mostly use tracking. Accessibility. Screen reader. Here's where we find something enormously promising but enormously disappointing. You can turn on this beautiful accessibility screen reader.
Volume. Setup tab. Accessibility group. Screen reader. Volume. 15. Button. Delete button. Display guide. Menu button back.
So it reads everything that's on your screen. Well, that's great. This would be great for people who have reduced vision using these cameras. But the problem is, this is pretty much the only screen it reads well. What is going on, Sony? So let's go to another very useful part of the camera. It's not reading it.
Setup tab, button, menu button close. Group, button, rear dial page. Move to non-readout target.
Move to non-readout target. So the vast majority of this menu, I went through most of it while in accessibility mode, is not readable. Why is it even an option? Sony, if you're gonna put this in here, you've got to do the full job. When I first saw it, I thought fantastic, but as soon as I just scratched a little bit below the surface, it is a completely hollow function, unfortunately. Last setting panel. Here's where we get to choose whether we are manually switching between the viewfinder and the monitor. You can, not super useful in the menu here, but you can put this on a button to switch. Some people love to do that. I have the monitor brightness set to this button, so I can change it any time. The viewfinder brightness, I have set to maximum most of the time. Then you can actually change the color temperature of the viewfinder, which is interesting. You couldn't do that before. And here you can change between, I think it's 60p and 120p for the viewfinder, but if you're at high speed, you can't have high resolution. If you go to low speed, you can go to high resolution. Now, setting these both to standard, you'll get better battery life. I generally go to standard speed and high resolution because the resolution is already poor on this. I don't want to make it any worse. Now, if I was doing sports or something, maybe I would set that to high speed. All right, for the time code, I don't want to get into that, but these are our time code settings. If you use time codes, you already know about this stuff. Most people don't. Gamma assist, again, as I said before, this gives you a preview of what a log or extended dynamic range profile will look on your screen instead of just showing you that flat look. And I always set that to auto, so it knows whether or not I'm in a profile and will switch to that automatically. And here is where it will show your buffer size. I only want that to appear while I'm actually pounding through the buffer, or you can turn that off, or you can leave it on all the time. Auto review, again, you can choose to have the image pop up on the screen after you've taken it for a certain amount of time. There's an interesting setting the past cameras didn't have. Instead of the whole camera falling asleep, you can just have the monitor turn off. There, it's off, comes back on, boom, right away. And then auto power off, I usually set that for 5 minutes because I like to have a lot of time. I will burn through as many batteries as I have to. And then you can choose whether or not it automatically goes into power off when you like close the monitor, flip it around, and so forth. This one, you have to change to high. This camera overheats so easily in standard. I was really surprised. When I'm using this camera next to an A7 III or an A9, this gets so much hotter, so much faster. And some people have found in warmer conditions that this will overheat in photo mode, which is pretty disappointing. That's kind of a shame. I don't know why this one is so susceptible to overheating. Volume setting, so that's the output volume of the camera itself. I set that nice and high. 4-channel audio monitoring. Why do we have 4-channel monitoring? Well, you can use a digital audio interface on the digital hot shoe here, which will let you have quadraphonic audio recording. But then how do you play it back? Well, you can choose what stereo pairs this operates as. So you can have channel 1, channel 2, or channel 3, channel 4, or 1 and 3, and 2 and 4, depending on how you want to listen to it in headphones. Doesn't matter much to me because I don't have that digital attachment. And then whether or not you have the audio signals on, I turn them off. I don't like to be obnoxious about that. USB connection mode. You usually set that to select when connect because I use different things here. So you could use PC remote, which is if you're tethering, the PC can kind of control things there. Mass storage, this just shows the contents of the SD cards to the computer. USB streaming, that's the new function where you can use this as a webcam. So we'll just select that every time we plug it in. USB LUN setting, just leave that on multi. You don't need to think about that. Power supply, whether or not this gets fed power through the USB-C port, of course you want that on. Now there might be times when, say, you're plugged into a laptop and you don't want to drain your laptop battery into the camera, you want to turn that off. But this has a phenomenal USB power delivery system where this will take in 9 volts at 1.5 amps, I think, which gives us, I think, 15 watts of charging. That's way faster than previous cameras. External output, so this is your HDMI out. You have a full-size HDMI port on this. And so, I manually set the resolution to 1080p because all my external monitors are 1080p, and then they connect much faster. There's no handshake going on. This is more for recording settings. If you're outputting to an external recorder, you can choose whether or not you record to the card and the output. As you might guess, I like to do both. You can change your output setting to 4K, and whether or not you write a time code while you're doing it, and which channels you're recording to that HDMI output. If you have a video light that is first party that syncs in, you can have that turn on as soon as you press record. Anti-dust function, this will rapidly shake the sensor to try to blow dust off. And you can also have it close the shutter when the camera is turned off. Pixel mapping, it scans the sensor to try to find dead or damaged or hot pixels, and then it will compensate for that in future pictures. So you can do that automatically or manually. Then finally, our version, we're just on 1.0 here, and it also tells the lens firmware version is number 2. Whew, we made it through. Did you survive? I think I barely did. My throat's getting sore. That was all of the settings in the A7 IV. If you have any questions about that or think I got anything wrong, let me know down in the comments below and we'll talk about that. Maybe I'll pin a comment if there are any addendums to make to this. So, if you have any energy left, let's go take some photos.